You're listening to the Faith and Order series, hosted in collaboration with the National Council of Churches in the United States, alongside the Center for Ecumenical and Interreligious Engagement at Seattle University.
This is Reid Trice, Director at the Center for Ecumenical and Interreligious Engagement at Seattle University. And today I'm speaking with Dr. Tony Kireopoulos, who's Associate General Secretary at the National Council of Churches US, where as Director of both Faith and Order, we're going to talk about that in a moment, and Interreligious Relations and Collaboration, Tony is responsible for theological dialogue among both ecumenical and interfaith partners. Those interfaith partners, by the way, include members from the Jewish, Muslim, Buddhist, Hindu, and Sikh communities. Tony is an Orthodox Christian theologian, and he previously directed and continues to contribute to the Council's work in interfaith relations and affairs and its advocacy on U.S. foreign policy issues. You can read more about Dr. Kireopoulos in the biographical section below this podcast. Welcome, Tony. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Michael. It's really a privilege to be part of this conversation, and to all of your colleagues at Religica and the Theolab, and ultimately to Seattle University. I want to give my thanks for having this program and for highlighting the work of Faith and Order. I'm looking forward to this conversation and to talking about Faith and Order, which is dear to my heart and has been even before I started with the National Council of Churches some 18, 19 years ago. So I really greatly appreciate this opportunity to share about Faith and Order and its historical work as well as its current work. Thank you.
Well, I appreciate that very much. And you know, this is a moment for conversation that's much needed as we're having this podcast. Just to place some context for the listener, we're going to talk about what Faith and Order is in a moment, but we all know what we're experiencing in one form or another, however unevenly in the world. We see geopolitical conflicts, food shortages, supply chain disruption, environmental challenges. And we also know that the statistics of Christian clergy who are leaving their call, not just their congregation, but their call, are staggering. So, for instance, we have a Barna survey about pastors in terms of their own sense of well-being on the brink of burnout, where 38% indicate they've considered quitting full-time ministry in the past year. And this percentage is up 9 full points. That's 29%. According to Barna, from the same time when the survey was taken in the beginning of 2021. So for the listener, when we see statistics of this kind in leadership leaving, it's concerning for us all because it sends a signal about how debilitating the political conflicts are within the country. And we require clergy in local communities to hold the line. And all that is required for a deeper sense of unity, and unity that is essential for getting through our historical moment. And that is what brings us to this conversation about Faith and Order, because the premise of our conversation that Tony and I have agreed on is that unity matters. Where churches talk to one another about the principles that form them, the longstanding work that's called the Faith and Order movement that we're going to be discussing, it's essential. So Tony, if we could start right there in terms of the Faith and Order movement or commission, what is it that we're talking about?
Thanks. And it's certainly difficult to hear those statistics. It's quite alarming. The church and all religious communities certainly have a role to play in the well-being or fostering the well-being of our society. And certainly we bring a moral framing to the questions of the day. So I guess I would start by just saying, you know, as a group of theologians that are sent by member churches of the NCC to Faith and Order, we hope to continue the great legacy that theology brings to answering these kinds of questions. All periods of history have had their challenges, but it's also a matter of Christian unity and the divisions within the church that are writ large in society and those kinds of divisions. And so for Faith and Order to work at Christian unity is a way to model the kind of work that needs to be done in society to bring that unity. So as far as what is Faith and Order, it has a long, long history. The ecumenical movement in general, which is defined by the search for Christian unity. Ultimately, that is its purpose, formally began well over 100 years ago. And the division that was seen between Christians at the time and their churches was seen as scandalous and also harming to the witness to Jesus Christ that Christians would bring to the world at large. And the ecumenical movement was seen as a way for churches to come together to find the unity that we can find around Jesus Christ, and to then have that joint witness and that kind of missionary mindset about preaching the gospel to those around us, and to do it together as divided Christians, but yet as Christians on the way toward what we would hope would be the ultimate goal of unity. Now, when it started, perhaps we could say that it was a Eurocentric kind of idea. Now it's a worldwide movement. It's together partners from across the globe, from every continent. And it also goes down into local communities. So most is like here in the United States, most major cities, states, they have local ecumenical councils and local groups of faith and order and local work, certainly interfaith partnerships as well, which is part of another conversation or extended conversation. But nevertheless, it's global and local. And that's important to remember. And even though we come out of it as the National Council of Churches and bring together denominations and member churches from 37 different communities, includes the Orthodox, the Anglican tradition, or the Episcopal Church, mainline Protestant communities, the historic peace churches, the historic African American churches. Those comprise the council itself, but even at this table with Faith and Order and in partnership on other issues or other work, say in the area of justice and advocacy, we also have the Roman Catholic Church as a partner, as well as some evangelical communities. So it's the broadest, I would say, the broadest collection and broadest coalition of communities to come together for the goal of Christian unity, however that's defined, and it changes. And we'll get into that probably in this conversation. It changes from time to time, or the focus of that search for Christian unity changes, but it's still seen as the heart of what the ecumenical movement is all about. It's said, and I'm sure I read this somewhere in the past, that at the beginning it was seen that there were two lungs of the ecumenical movement. One was faith and order, the other life and works. And so therefore you had theology and worship and prayer and spiritual formation on one side. And then you also had practical theology and working for justice on the other side, or in the other lung. And those two formed the body that is the ecumenical movement. As far as Faith and Order's role in that, it provides the theological building blocks to inform that search for unity. And it provides the kind of thinking theologically that drives that particular question of unity. So even though the focus may change from time to time, the drive, the impetus is still there as a theological impetus. And that's what Faith and Order seeks to witness to as it continues its work.
And Tony, in terms of, thank you so much for this introduction. This, I think, should help the listener considerably. And for those who may think, okay, well, why does unity matter in this regard? You mentioned 100 years. We can go back and look at the last 100 years. So, for instance, in 1948, statistics at that time revealed that at least 1/5 of Christians in the world had been displaced at the end or the close of World War II. There are reasons why, therefore, these kinds of conversations, the sinews of these discussions, both theologically or organizationally, with the beginning of the major conciliar movement, Lutheran World Federation, World Council of Churches, and others, we required these kinds of discussions and organizations to help reconfigure daily, normal, quote unquote, life. In that regard, and in light of some of the, say, challenges we're experiencing today, why should Faith and Order matter to us today, to the listener, and to the average person who would say, this is important that it's taking place in the world? How would you respond to that question?
I think I'd start with a little bit more of the history, because you mentioned the date, 1948. So the idea of Faith and Order was around from the beginning, and it first kind of appeared as a theme in 1910. The movement itself kind of brought itself together into a coherent movement in 1927 that was then brought into the World Council of Churches in 1948. So already from 1910 through 1948, there was a desire to put some theological bones into the body of the ecumenical movement that had already started globally. In the United States, Faith and Order was started in 1957. So for the churches that are part of the ecumenical councils, for the World Council churches, the National Council of Churches in other contexts, other countries, it's important to these churches that theology doesn't stand alone. And we all do some theology. There are many theologians listening in. There are many, many theologians at the Faith and Order table. We all do theology on our own, in our academic settings, in practical settings, in the churches. But it's housed in Faith and Order itself. This particular task of theology is housed in ecumenical organizations because it's at those places that the churches can meet together to study these theological issues, these theological questions. And that's one reason I think it matters, because it matters to the denominations and to the major churches and the small churches that are part of the NCC. And then more broadly speaking, with the, like I said, the Catholic Church and some evangelical communities, that we do this together. So therefore, the movement, the Faith and Order movement, provides not only a context for the churches pursue these questions together, but also keeps that long-term goal of Christian unity on the front burner. I'll admit there's an eternal timeline to all this work. So it's not like we're going to have this unity tomorrow. However, there are issues of ecclesial divisions, Eucharistic division, moral divisions, different ways of witnessing to justice and peace. All of these help inform the quest for unity. All of them are part of the discussion of unity. So in my view, and in the view of many, what better place than in ecumenical settings, and particularly in Faith and Order, for the churches to do this together. So as to why it matters, I would think that's what sums it up, is it provides the place for churches to do this theology and this kind of thinking together. There are certainly principles and assumptions that we all have as churches, that each of our churches has. But we can't just rely on those assumptions. We need to plumb them. We need to explore them together and see, what do we really hold in common? Where are we really different? Because sometimes superficial divisions keep us really far apart, when in reality, we're very close on many, many things. And so to have this common thinking, this common language, that's why it matters, is to bring the churches together for that.
This is helpful. I want to ask you, as you're mentioning Christian unity, what is that as an effort today in the world? Maybe you could say a little more about what's happening there and about the unity around theological convictions. But before that, let me ask a little different question. Unity is so important to these Christian communities. It has been historically, as you've identified. And we live in a moment in this country, but not alone in this country, also in the world, where you see the rise, let's say, popular religious nationalism. You might even say in the US or in India and other global contexts. But let's just take the US for a moment, where you have Christians who disagree on, say, rock bottom core principles. Like, how do you read scripture? How do you understand the nature of truth? How do you follow Jesus Christ? Is Jesus a political figure, a spiritual figure? For those who follow Jesus Christ, how do we understand political allegiances or affiliations in a way that don't create deeper division? With those kinds of challenges, Tony, in this whole discourse around unity, is that impacting the ecumenical experience today in the country?
Thank you for that question. It's a challenging question. It's a challenge that all the churches face. So I think that the churches that come together in the ecumenical sphere, they would share certain principles about who Jesus is and why we do the work we do in terms of justice, advocacy, in terms of peacemaking, our relationships with other faiths, etc. And the wider world, certainly those divisions and those challenges do make things awfully difficult for the churches to make that witness. So in the example of Christian nationalism, actually it was the NCC's Interreligious table, the other area that I directed with the council, that crafted a policy statement on the dangers of Christian nationalism in the United States. Because of the identification of Christianity with a certain political position, if not political entities, we see that as very dangerous to our own society. But we also see it, as you said, in India and other places, particularly as it affects Christian communities and the persecution of Christians abroad. We felt it was important to start with Christian nationalism here, but yet we can't ignore the religious nationalisms that take place elsewhere.
Yeah.
And so that remains a challenge for us. We have interfaith partners where discussions such as those are likely to take place in the future. But now that we have this policy statement, it grounds all of the work of the National Council of Churches with regard to Christian nationalism here. And it tries to bring the churches to a point where they can face that misidentification of Christianity with political power, political movements, political destruction even, and tries to bring healing interpretation to society at large.
This is such an important series of points that you're making here, because as we know from the Barna report noted earlier, a high percentage of clergy are thinking of leaving their calls entirely. Now, that's not to be alarmist, but where you see conflicting and even competing principles in local communities, it shows up in congregations, it shows up in local contexts. All the more reason why the theological plumbing, the work you're talking about, and Faith and Order, which provides some content, I imagine, to those kinds of policy documents, to thinking about, for instance, how do we understand the kind of tactile way in which Christian claims to meaning and truth show up, not just universally, but today, in this context, amidst the challenges we're having right now. And I want to ask you then, as we're discussing Christian unity, could you say something about what are the kinds of discussions, or what about unity around theological conversations or convictions that's happening today in our context that you think the listener would also benefit from really knowing more about in terms of Faith and Order?
Right. So thank you for that question as well. I would say first, as I start, that when we talk about Christian unity, we're not talking about uniformity. So we all have different traditions, rich traditions and histories in our communities that we bring to the table, and that it's important to lift up for others to understand. So part of the task is to understand one another, where we come from, and to explore differences, not so much in those cultural and historical manifestations in our communities, but instead, how do we approach then political issues today, as you're getting to with your question? So how we overcome key divisions and still maintain our integral distinctiveness as individual communities, that's certainly part of the task, and it's a work in progress. I would say, to more specifically answer your question, for the National Council of Churches, and I would say for every ecumenical organization, working for justice is number one as far as the task. Number one is theology that informs that task, but the justice imperative is critical to our identity as Christians. Mm-hmm. Now, that may take the form of working for war and peace. What do we say about today's conflict in Ukraine and Russia? What do we say about the Middle East? What do we say about, in the last couple of decades, Iraq, Afghanistan? Those kinds of war and peace issues, peace and conflict issues, those are central to who we are in terms of giving witness. Then there are issues of poverty and inequities in society, and what is a way that the churches can speak to those issues? What about issues regarding climate change? Mm-hmm. And what do we say as the faith community in terms or with regard to climate change issues and environmental degradation? Mm-hmm. I would say, as the Faith and Order director, that there is a link here to really our integral understanding to who God is and who we are as Christians.
Could you say more about that?
Yeah. So in the Orthodox tradition, we have a thing called theosis. God became a man, so human beings could become like God. So how do we really become like God? It's a matter of belief and faith, but it's also a matter of witness and working for justice and to heal the world and heal communities, whether it's refugees, immigrants at the border, any host of issues should command our attention as Christians. because we seek to become like God. That's our ultimate calling as Christians. And to become like God, we participate in community, we worship the triune God, the Trinity, but we also witness as Christ witnessed injustice and justice in his time.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say that further, that if we're divided, and this is again where faith and order touches the life and works kind of, the two lungs come together in one. If we're divided as churches, what does that say about our witness? What does that say about who we are as the church? And how is that manifested in our relationship with others? So the two are intimately united in terms of the justice issues, even beyond ecumenical work and our interfaith work, for example. We seek to have a unified voice, but it doesn't mean that we're united theologically, because we each come, at least in the interfaith world, we come with different ideas of God, different ideas in terms of theology. But yet we still seek to heal whatever divisions we can, whether it's a unified voice or in the ecumenical sphere, come together as Christians seeking to be fuller witnesses of Christ, to bring justice to matters of injustice.
It seems clear to me that in popular culture, Christians are often referred to as one brand. We often think of Christianity as one thing. And where we have a general sense, let's say, in society of disapproval of one branch of the Christian tradition over another, we don't really make that nuanced assessment. We just say it's Christianity or it's organized religion. But what you're talking about, and I think it's important for the listener to understand in your initial comments about the difference between unity and uniformity, is that unity requires, and indeed, considers a significant amount of diversity and difference inside that Christian, might say, the Christian tree. There's lots of branches to this. There may be one trunk or tradition going back 2,000 years, and even, of course, long before, but there are manifold expressions within this larger family. And so it's a bit of a mistake to talk about Christianity in a monolithic sense, like it's only one thing, which just makes this work toward unity that much more important. It's kind of like threading the needle. It's really through these theological principles as you're discussing. Do you think that in this country we would do better by being able to make these distinctions between different expressions of Christianity, or maybe am I over accentuating that point? What is your read on this?
Well, I think especially partners outside of the churches or outside of the faith community writ large, in terms of interfaith communities, I think there is kind of that assumption. So on the one hand, I think it's my role, for example, to speak for many Christian traditions. I work in an ecumenical organization. You work in a Catholic university with many students and faculty from other faiths. It's incumbent upon us, or maybe I'm feeling this more as a spokesperson for the ecumenical community, but to speak for all of the traditions, or at least some of the traditions that are there, and to make those nuances when it's important. In fact, I was on a webinar yesterday, and some of those generalizations were kind of assumed. And so a couple of questions were raised about, well, what about the differences? What about the nuances here? That we can't just assume that we're all the same, we're on the same page with these things. So yes, I think it's important, and it's important for people to speak for their own traditions. But where it's helpful and where it's necessary, I think it's important for those of us who are privileged to be in these kinds of settings to speak for others. In fact, when that phrase actually triggered something else. Our interfaith relations, for example, with the Jewish community, Muslim community, Sikhs, Buddhists, and Hindus, certainly the desire is there to build relationship and to build a strong relationship. And certainly the goal is there to bring more understanding of each other's traditions so we don't make mistakes when we talk about, say, Hinduism. But it's also to be in solidarity with one another to the point where we can speak for the other.
Can you give an example of that? How does that show up in society?
Well, for example, when the Muslim community suffers Islamophobic violence, or when the Jewish community suffers anti-Semitic violence, like a week or two ago in Colleyville, Texas. It's incumbent upon Christians to speak for those communities and to say, when they are harmed, we are harmed. And we come from the point of intimate knowledge of that other community. And it's not just because it's the right thing to say, but it's because it's who we are and who we are to others and who they are to us. And therefore that it calls us to speak for them in those cases of suffering. All communities suffer hardship. And so to be in solidarity with one another is more than just locking arms and doing work together, but it's really speaking for one another when other is in pain. So in the Christian context, that's where I think it's important to be able to speak for others. Certainly we want to lift their voices as members of those communities. But when it's called upon to be in solidarity with one another and to say, I know who you are and I want to be of help. And how am I of help? When I assume the place you're in. Mm-hmm. And that becomes, your suffering becomes my suffering. And I'm speaking on behalf of you because I know you're vulnerable at this time. Mm-hmm. And so any number of issues like that happen within the interfaith context. Probably less so among Christians, although let's be clear, there are certainly certain Christian communities that espouse even violence, as we've seen in the last year. The insurrection was part of that.
The insurrection on January 6th of 2021, you're referring to there?
Yes. And, how many Christian symbols did we see in that crowd,
Plenty.
So we need to stand up for our faith, for our God, and say, this is not who we are.
There's something really compelling about a brand of religious nationalism, because since we're discussing this in relation to faith and order, because there's a charisma or an energy around it. It feels good. Everything's clarified. You can see the beginning, middle, and end. The principles you have are very clear and guide your action. And there's a groupthink that develops around a sense of a national purpose, whether that's historically accurate or not. You get this kind of mythos or kind of mythic sensibility about the nostalgia of a country and moving forward and who that's for. It's very difficult, I think, in the face of that, to say to those brands of Christian nationalists that the quest for unity, the theological principles and adequate and deep understanding of the work and ministry and life of Jesus Christ, that all of that is not congruent with the fervor of a kind of Christian nationalism. It doesn't line up. That's a very kind of threatening thing to say, because it seems to me in that form of Christian nationalist spirit, I'm all in. It's not just a belief. Like I'm rethinking how I understand my world in light of that. Faith and Order has quite a job in front of it, doesn't it? In terms of responding to those kinds of challenges. Now, you mentioned that policy document, that's essential, but there have been other challenges like this for the listener. I mean, there is a past of conversations on really essential issues in the life of this country. And I wonder if you could, just tell the listener something about those past discussions in Faith and Order and the present ones as well, that I think would fit well with, response to how Christians are engaging with one another in this country today.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. And to segue into it from where you started that question, the discussion of Christian nationalism, well, there have always been the temptation to power among Christian churches. Mm-hmm. Whether you go back to early empires, to powerful countries, and today, or in the last, recent history in our countries, there's always been that temptation to power. And this is, I think, the latest attempt to link our faith with the quest for power and to maintain power. Mm-hmm. And like you said, it's based on a myth. It's based on historical inaccuracies, and it's ultimately based on wrong theology. Mm-hmm. Because, as we know, Christ was the embodiment of humility. He went to the cross for us. When he was tempted in the desert, he had the power to, when he was in the story, when he was tempted with riches and power and all that, he declined. So our faith is really one that goes counter to that narrative of Christian nationalism. And as you said, and here I'll jump into the kinds of issues over the years that Faith and Order in particular has looked at. We've looked at things such as women's leadership in the church. That was its own challenge many years ago. Now, many churches, nobody remembers those times. But yet, I think it was early as 1991 when Faith and Order had a work and came out with a volume on women's leadership in the church. 1991, so that's 30 years ago. Looked at issues of authority of the church in the world, and things that such as authority in the church. That was in the mid-2000s. We've looked at our peace witness. That's always been part of the council, but certainly 1990s, 2000s, Faith and Order looked at that specifically. Poverty in the mid-2000s, mass incarceration, just a few years ago, 2017. Interfaith peacemaking and the theological imperatives to that was just a couple of years ago. We looked at violence and genocide issues just 2 years ago. So over all these years, and certainly since 1957, Faith and Order has tried to bring a moral imperative to these issues and to speak with moral authority and to help the churches do so. Today, we're looking at an issue that is central to the challenges we face as a society, but also central to the National Council of Churches writ large. A few years ago, we identified the priority of the council over the next period to be working to end racism. And the initiative is called ACT, to end racism. A for awaken, C for confront, T for transform. And so all areas of the council, including Faith and Order, work on racism and how it affects the church and how it affects our society. Faith and Order used to look at abstract issues or issues that it felt were important. I mentioned some of them before: authority, peace, poverty, things like that. But now we look at what is it about racism? What is divisive in that conversation? And how do we talk about unity? The mission of Faith and Order is to look at church dividing, church uniting issues. What is it in the conversation about racism that is church dividing and church uniting? And so now we're doing 3 studies, one looking at racism as the original sin of the United States. Is that the right paradigm to use? What are some of the incarnational and eschatological questions that we bring to it? What is it about? Is it just a temporal designation, the original sin, or is there something else to it? And so the churches are looking at that. Also, we're looking at white supremacy as the defining myth of the United States. And this one speaks most directly to the Christian nationalism question. How do Christians live out a different reality than one that assumes white supremacy in all of our structures, including the church? Can we free ourselves of this legacy? And how do we do so? How can the churches advise those in their pews to look at life a different way? And then the third area is looking at racism. And this conversation today is part of it. Transforming the church and humanizing the public square. What do we need to do in the church to do this? And how do we get that message out? And opportunities like this, and I'm really grateful for this opportunity in particular to highlight the work of Faith and Order. How do we influence society and what can be done in practical ways? And so this idea of transforming and humanizing is the third area of work in today's Faith and Order.
You know, as you're mentioning those most recent themes, I think given the divisions in the country, there may be some listening and saying, oh, you know, whether one is if we use this kind of spectrum, whether one is on the far left or the far right, there are kinds of guiding ideologies for all of this. But I don't sense that in this Faith and Order Commission and on the themes you just identified. I think this is an honest discussion about historical structural racism, about how we understand its impact in a country in terms of the guiding principles that are shaped, often without an understanding of some of the societal or cultural forces that are at work. So, differentiating all of that from the core narrative of a Christian quest for deeper unity and solidarity, as you mentioned. following in the life of Jesus Christ, which is so important for the Faith and Order Commission's work, in a persona of both humility on the one hand, but with a kind of a fierce tenaciousness for identifying where injustice is also taking place, and the Christian call to do the same today. That's not easy, but it means these theological themes are also not going to be kind of softballs. They're going to be something that's more significant. And if people occasionally get upset with these themes, it means, I think, often those conversations are doing the right thing, because it is a disruptionist piece to serious theological engagement that has cultural impact in our lives.
I say that's exactly right. And, we all do some theology. We all do work for justice. But if we can intentionally come together and seek out that unity, we can provide foundations or at least a context for why we do it as Christians.
Well, and Tony, one more question on this. In terms of, as we wrap up our time, the Faith and Order Commission for the National Council of Churches, as I understand it, and you have a number of practitioners, theologians, there's deans, professors, clergy, lay people. I mean, these are folks that come from different walks of life of the Christian churches that you and your organization represent. When you think of those colleagues and the work being done, what stays with you most that you'd like to share with the listener?
I think what stays with me most is the commitment everybody brings to the work.
Yeah.
There's an intentionality. There's a desire for better understanding of one another and one another's traditions. That idea, I think, and this isn't being glib, I think the participants in Faith and Order see it as a gift and an opportunity that doesn't exist elsewhere, where they could come together and explore these questions together, argue about them, wrestle with them, resolve some issues together. That's an opportunity that we don't always have. And so this is a place that I'm privileged to work with or work in, but it's also a privilege to be together with those colleagues who have that equal commitment to this kind of work. Sometimes it surprises me because everybody's got their own jobs, right? And their own lives, their own families, their own side work, all sorts of things. And yet to make time for this, not only for the meetings that take place during the year, but also to work on these studies and other areas together in between the meetings, and to seek the publications together, and to provide this kind of work for their churches and for all the churches together. I'm really grateful to them for displaying that kind of commitment and that kind of zeal.
Well, thank you, Dr. Tony Kireopoulos, for your leadership and for taking the time to be in conversation with us today. If the listener would like to learn more about Faith and Order through the auspices of the National Council of Churches, you can do that. Go to www.nationalcouncilofchurches.us/Christian-unity. Visit that website and learn more. Thanks so much, Tony, again.
Michael, thank you very much. And to all your colleagues, thank you.
You've been listening to the Religica Theolab podcast in the Center for Ecumenical and Interreligious Engagement at Seattle University. To learn more about the center's work and for resources to be used in local communities, visit us at seattleu.edu/thecenter. To learn more about the National Council of Churches in the U.S., visit them at nationalcouncilofchurches.us.